Felix asks one heartbreaking question that shakes Hyunjin to his core, forcing them to face the truth they have avoided for years. "May I still wait for you?" Felix's words made Hyunjin tremble. The train doors slid open with a metallic sigh, just as Felix's trembling voice cut through the crowded platform. "May I still wait for you?" Hyunjin stopped walking. The question was so quiet that no one else seemed to hear it, yet it echoed louder than every announcement blaring from the station speakers. His fingers tightened around the strap of his worn backpack until his knuckles turned white. He had imagined countless reunions over the past 2 years, but never this one, and certainly not with those 6 simple words. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. People brushed past them, umbrellas dripping onto the polished floor after an afternoon rain. The scent of wet concrete mixed with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifting from a nearby cafe. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed while an arriving train screamed against the rails. Everything around them continued. Only time between them stood still. Felix looked different. His blonde hair had grown slightly longer, falling over tired eyes that carried the weight of sleepless nights. He still wore the silver bracelet Hyunjin had once won for him at a small seaside festival years ago. The tiny charm hanging from it had faded with time, but he had never taken it off. Hyunjin noticed it immediately, his chest tightened. "You kept it." Felix lowered his eyes for a moment before smiling softly. "I promised I would." That answer hurt more than Hyunjin expected. Promises he had once believed promises could survive distance. He had been wrong. "I shouldn't have come," Hyunjin whispered. "But you did." I almost turned around. Felix nodded as though he already knew. "You always hesitate when you're afraid." Hyunjin looked away, fear. That word followed him everywhere. 2 years earlier, fear had convinced him that leaving was the only way to protect the person he loved most. He had accepted an overseas opportunity without saying goodbye properly, believing that disappearing would hurt Felix less than asking him to endure uncertainty. Instead, silence became its own cruelty. Letters were written but never sent. Calls were answered only by voicemail. Birthdays passed with messages typed, erased, and typed again before disappearing forever. Neither of them truly moved on. They merely learned how to hide the emptiness. Felix took one careful step closer. "I searched for reasons to hate you." Hyunjin swallowed hard. "Couldn't." The word struck him harder than any accusation ever could. "I tried," Felix continued quietly. "Every morning I told myself that forgetting you would make life easier." His voice trembled. "But every evening I caught myself wondering if you had eaten, if you were sleeping enough, if someone was reminding you to carry a jacket whenever it rained." Jin laughed weakly despite the tears threatening his eyes. "You still remember that? You always forgot." A fragile silence settled between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, like opening an old music box whose melody had never truly disappeared. Hyunjin looked at Felix carefully. There were tiny changes only someone who had loved him deeply could notice. A faint scar near his wrist, slight shadows beneath his eyes, the habit of rubbing his thumb against the bracelet whenever he felt nervous. He realized with painful certainty that he still knew Felix better than anyone else, and perhaps that was exactly why he had stayed away, because if he came back, he would never be strong enough to leave again. "I wasn't brave," Hyunjin admitted. "I know. I thought disappearing would protect you." Felix shook his head slowly. "It only taught me what loneliness sounds like." Rain tapped softly against the station windows. Neither of them noticed. "I kept every photo," Felix confessed. "I deleted mine." "I know." Hyunjin stared at him in surprise. "I recovered them." A tiny laugh escaped Hyunjin before tears finally blurred his vision. "You really are impossible." "Are you?" The first time in years, they smiled at each other without pretending, not because the pain had disappeared, but because they finally allowed themselves to acknowledge it. Hyunjin looked down at the ticket still clutched inside his hand. It was a one-way ticket. He had planned to leave again that evening. Another city, another beginning, another escape. Felix noticed it instantly. "So you're leaving again?" Hyunjin couldn't answer. His silence said enough. Felix closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again with quiet determination. "I won't stop you." Hyunjin felt his heart sink. "But before you go," Felix stepped forward until only a breath separated them. His voice was barely above a whisper. "If your journey is something you truly need, then go." Hyunjin felt tears sliding down his cheeks. "But if you're leaving because you're still afraid," Felix gently touched the silver bracelet on his own wrist. "Then let me tell you something no one ever told us." Hyunjin looked into his eyes. "You don't have to carry every burden alone." Station announcements echoed once more. Passengers hurried toward the departing train. Hyunjin slowly lowered the ticket in his trembling hand. For the first time in years, he understood that courage was not walking away from someone you loved, sometimes. Courage was staying. The evening rain gradually softened until only tiny droplets remained on the glass roof above them. Outside, the clouds slowly parted, allowing thin streams of golden sunset to spill across the station floor like quiet promises of another beginning. Hyunjin looked at Felix, truly looked at him, without fear, without excuses, and without pretending that distance could erase what had always existed between them. "I'm sorry," he whispered. Felix smiled through his tears. "I know." Neither of them rushed toward an ending. Neither of them demanded immediate forgiveness. Instead, they walked out of the station side by side, carrying the scars of the past, but no longer allowing those scars to decide their future. Sometimes love did not ask for certainty. Sometimes all it asked was the courage to stay long enough to answer one simple question. "May I still wait for you?" And this time, Hyunjin finally knew the answer. The morning sunlight slipped through the apartment window, painting pale gold across the wooden floor as Hyunjin stood silently in the kitchen, staring at 2 untouched cups of coffee. He had forgotten how Felix liked his. 2 years ago, he could have prepared it without thinking. 1 spoon of sugar, a splash of warm milk. Never too hot. Now he hesitated over every movement. Behind him, Felix leaned quietly against the doorway, watching without saying a word. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, but neither was there complete peace. Trust, once broken, did not return overnight. "You don't remember, do you?" Felix asked gently. Hyunjin lowered his head. "Remember everything that mattered." Felix smiled sadly. "Then why are you guessing?" Hyunjin let out a quiet laugh that sounded closer to a sigh. "Because I'm afraid of getting even the smallest thing wrong." Felix walked over and took the spoon from his hand. "You used to tell me coffee wasn't about perfection." Hyunjin looked at him. "It's about sharing it with someone." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence felt lighter than before, not empty, comfortable. After breakfast, they wandered through the streets they had once explored together. The neighborhood had changed. New cafes had opened. Familiar bookstores had disappeared. Trees along the sidewalks had grown taller, their branches casting dancing shadows across the pavement. Yet some places refused to change. The old music shop still stood on the corner. Its faded sign creaked gently in the breeze. Felix stopped walking. "Remember?" Hyunjin nodded. "This is where you bought your first guitar pick." "Where you spent an hour choosing the wrong one." Hyunjin laughed. "I still have it." Felix turned in surprise. "You kept it?" "I threw away almost everything before I left." His smile slowly disappeared. "But not the things that reminded me of you." Felix's eyes glistened. Neither of them noticed the elderly shop owner smiling quietly from inside the store as they stepped through the familiar doorway. Dust floated lazily through warm afternoon light. The scent of polished wood and old vinyl records wrapped around them like forgotten memories. The owner recognized them immediately. "I wondered when you'd come back together." Hyunjin blinked. "You remember us? You two argued for 20 minutes over which guitar sounded warmer." Felix laughed. "And he still lost." "I let you win." "You definitely didn't." Shop owner chuckled, leaving them alone among rows of instruments. For the first time in years, their laughter sounded natural, real. But happiness could not erase everything. As they wandered deeper into the shop, Hyunjin noticed an old photograph pinned to a bulletin board. It had been taken during a neighborhood music festival. They were standing shoulder to shoulder, smiling without restraint, young, fearless, certain the future belonged to them. Hyunjin carefully removed the photograph. "I thought this was gone." Felix looked at it quietly. "I came here every month." Hyunjin froze. "Every month?" "I kept hoping you'd walk through that door." Confession landed heavily between them. Hyunjin closed his eyes. "I don't deserve that kind of loyalty." Felix answered honestly. "Don't." Words stung, but Felix wasn't finished. "You deserve something harder." Hyunjin looked up. "Chance to become someone who never runs away again." Several seconds, Hyunjin couldn't speak. He had expected punishment, blame, even hatred. Instead, Felix offered responsibility. It felt heavier than either. That evening, they sat beside the river where they had once spent countless nights talking about impossible dreams. The water reflected thousands of city lights. A cool breeze carried the scent of rain-soaked grass. Hyunjin finally spoke. "When I left, I convinced myself you'd eventually hate me." Felix skipped a small stone across the water. "I tried. And it never lasted." Hyunjin smiled faintly. "I'm sorry I made loving me so difficult." Felix looked toward the shimmering river. Loving you was never difficult. He paused, trusting that you would stay. That became difficult. Hyunjin felt the weight of those words settle deep inside him. I can't erase what I did. I want to spend however long it takes proving I've changed. Felix didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the old silver bracelet. Its tiny charm was scratched and faded. I wore this because it reminded me of who you were. He gently placed it into Hyunjin's hand. If we're going to begin again. Hyunjin stared at it silently. I don't want to remember who you were. Felix's eyes met his. I want to discover who you've become. Hyunjin carefully closed his fingers around the bracelet, as though holding something infinitely more fragile than silver. In that quiet moment, neither of them spoke of forever. They spoke only of tomorrow. Because sometimes the strongest promise is not a lifetime. Sometimes it is simply choosing, day after day, not to walk away again. The first crack of thunder rolled across the evening sky just as Hyunjin's phone vibrated with a notification he had hoped would never appear again. His smile disappeared. Felix, who had been arranging books on a nearby shelf, noticed the sudden change in his expression. What happened? For a long moment, Hyunjin simply stared at the screen. The sender's name pulled him back to a chapter of his life he had buried beneath years of silence. It can wait. Felix slowly shook his head. Hidden enough things. Hyunjin inhaled deeply before handing him the phone. The message was short. I heard you're back. We need to talk. No explanation, no greeting, just those words. Felix looked at Hyunjin, not with suspicion, but with concern. You don't have to face it alone. Hyunjin smiled weakly. Spent years convincing myself that protecting people meant carrying everything by myself. Did it? The question settled quietly between them. Hyunjin lowered his eyes. No. Rain began falling outside, tapping softly against the apartment windows. The city lights blurred into shimmering colors beyond the glass, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. Felix walked over and stood beside him. When you disappeared, Hyunjin remained silent. I blamed myself. Hyunjin turned toward him immediately. You shouldn't have. I did. Felix rested his hands on the windowsill. I kept asking what I had done wrong. His voice was calm, yet every word carried years of quiet pain. I wondered if I wasn't enough. Hyunjin's chest tightened. You were always enough. Then why did you leave? The question wasn't angry, it was honest. Hyunjin closed his eyes. My father became seriously ill. Felix blinked in surprise. Never told anyone. His voice trembled as memories resurfaced. Medical bills kept growing. The opportunity overseas was the only job that could support my family. Felix listened without interrupting. I wanted to tell you everything. Hyunjin looked away. But every time I imagined your face, I knew you'd ask me to stay. I would have. I know, I would have helped. Hyunjin smiled sadly. That's exactly why I couldn't let you. Silence filled the room once again, not because there was nothing left to say, because both of them finally understood how much had remained unsaid. Felix stepped closer. You thought love meant protecting me from your burdens. Hyunjin nodded. I thought love meant sharing them. Difference between those two beliefs had stolen years they could never reclaim. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The rain continued to fall, steady and gentle, washing dust from the streets below. Eventually, Hyunjin laughed softly. You know what's strange? What? I spent 2 years rehearsing speeches for this moment. And I forgot every single one. Felix laughed quietly. Good. Hyunjin looked confused. Like the truth better than rehearsed words. That simple sentence eased something inside Hyunjin that had been tense for years. The next morning, they decided to revisit the small hill overlooking the city, a place they used to escape whenever life became overwhelming. The climb was slower than either of them remembered. They paused halfway up, catching their breath. Guess we're getting older, Felix joked. Hyunjin laughed. Speak for yourself. When they finally reached the top, the city stretched beneath them, glowing under the soft light breaking through the clouds after the storm. A gentle breeze carried the scent of pine and damp earth. Felix sat on the familiar wooden bench. It's smaller than I remembered. Hyunjin sat beside him. Maybe we just grew. For a while, they watched the horizon in peaceful silence. Then Hyunjin reached into his jacket pocket. Have something. He unfolded a worn envelope, its edges softened by time. I wrote this the week after I left. Felix accepted it carefully. You never sent it. Couldn't. Inside was a handwritten letter, faded but still legible. It spoke of fear, guilt, homesickness, and a love that distance had never weakened. Felix read every line slowly. By the time he reached the final sentence, tears blurred the ink. He folded the letter carefully and handed it back. You should have sent it. I know. I'm glad I can hear those words from you now. Hyunjin nodded, his eyes glistening. No more unsent letters. Felix smiled warmly. No more running. They sat together as the evening sun dipped below the skyline, bathing the city in shades of amber and gold. Neither of them pretended that healing was complete. There were still difficult conversations ahead. There would still be days when old fears resurfaced. But for the first time in years, those fears no longer stood between them. They faced them together, side by side, discovering that sometimes the longest journey was not the distance between two cities, but the distance between silence and honesty.
Scent of freshly baked bread drifted through the quiet morning air as Hyunjin unlocked the door to a small cafe they used to visit every Sunday. For a moment he simply stood there. Nothing had changed. The old wooden tables were still marked with tiny scratches from years of conversations. The soft jazz music still floated through the room. Even the elderly barista greeted them with the same warm smile that had once made this place feel like a second home. "You finally came back," she said gently. Hyunjin smiled, though there was sadness behind it. "It took me longer than it should have." She nodded as if she already understood. Sometimes people lose their way before they learn where home really is. Felix glanced at Hyunjin, who quietly lowered his eyes. They chose the table beside the window where raindrops traced delicate patterns across the glass. Years ago, they had spent countless afternoons there, dreaming about futures that had seemed limitless. Back then, they believed love alone could solve every problem. Now they knew better. Love needed honesty, it needed patience, most of all it needed two people willing to remain when life became difficult. The waitress placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. Without thinking, Hyunjin reached for the sugar and added exactly 1 spoon before pouring a small splash of warm milk into Felix's cup. Felix watched him with surprise. "You remembered." Hyunjin smiled softly. "I didn't forget." "I thought you had." "I was afraid I had." Felix lifted the cup, taking a careful sip. The taste was exactly as he remembered. For the first time in years, the distance between memory and reality no longer felt painful, it felt comforting. As they sat together, conversation flowed more naturally than it had in a long time. They spoke about ordinary things, books they had read, songs they had discovered, places they wanted to visit someday. There was something beautiful about discussing simple dreams again. Not because they were extraordinary, because they had once believed they would never share them again. Later that afternoon, they walked through a nearby park where children chased one another beneath towering trees. The laughter surrounding them was contagious. Felix paused near a small bridge crossing a quiet pond. "I used to come here." Hyunjin looked at him, nodded. "Whenever I missed you." Hyunjin's heart tightened. "I imagined you sitting beside me." He smiled faintly. "I would tell you about my week, even though you couldn't answer." Hyunjin looked toward the calm water, unable to hide the guilt filling his eyes. "I don't deserve someone who waited that long." Felix stepped closer. "This isn't about what you deserve." "What is it about?" "It's about what we choose now." The words settled gently into Hyunjin's heart. He realized Felix had stopped living in the past. Perhaps it was time he did the same. That evening they returned to Hyunjin's apartment carrying groceries for dinner. They laughed while trying to cook together, though neither of them seemed particularly talented in the kitchen. Hyunjin accidentally dropped vegetables onto the floor. Felix burned the first batch of rice. Smoke filled the kitchen just enough to force them to open every window. Instead of becoming frustrated, they laughed until tears filled their eyes. The apartment, once silent and heavy with regret, echoed with warmth again. After dinner, they carried their mugs of tea onto the small balcony. The city shimmered beneath countless lights. A cool breeze brushed against their faces. "Been thinking," Hyunjin said quietly. Felix turned toward him. "For years, I kept asking myself how to make up for everything I lost. And I finally realized I can't." Felix listened without speaking. "I can't erase those years. Can't give us back the birthdays we missed. No, can't undo your loneliness." Felix gently rested a hand on Hyunjin's shoulder. "You don't have to." Hyunjin looked at him. "The past isn't asking us to rewrite it." His voice remained calm. "It's asking us to learn from it." Hyunjin felt tears gathering once again. "So what do we do now?" Felix smiled, a quiet, sincere smile that reached his eyes. "We live the days we still have." Answer was simple, yet it carried a truth Hyunjin had searched for across countless sleepless nights. He had spent years trying to repair yesterday. Felix was inviting him to protect tomorrow instead. The wind carried the faint fragrance of jasmine blooming somewhere below. The city continued its restless rhythm, unaware of two hearts slowly finding peace above the streets. Hyunjin closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking. "Thank you for waiting." Felix shook his head gently. "I wasn't waiting for the past to return." He looked toward the endless skyline before meeting Hyunjin's eyes once more. "I was waiting for you to find your way back to yourself." Hyunjin felt something inside him finally settle. The guilt that had followed him for years did not disappear completely, but it no longer controlled him. Beside the person he loved, beneath a sky scattered with quiet stars, he understood that healing was not a single moment. It was a choice made every day. For the first time in a very long time, both of them were ready to make that choice together. The first rays of dawn spilled across the balcony, turning the sleeping city into a sea of gold as Hyunjin woke to the gentle sound of rain tapping against the railing. For a few seconds he simply listened. The apartment no longer felt unbearably quiet. From the kitchen came the soft clatter of ceramic cups and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Hyunjin smiled before even opening his eyes. Felix was awake. He walked into the kitchen with messy hair and sleepy eyes, stopping when he saw Felix standing by the window, humming softly while preparing breakfast. Felix looked over his shoulder and laughed. "You finally decided to wake up." "I followed the smell of coffee." "I knew you would." Hyunjin stepped beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the rain slide down the windowpane. It was an ordinary morning. Months ago, Hyunjin would have considered it meaningless. Now he realized these quiet moments were the ones he had missed the most. "I used to dream about this," Felix admitted. Hyunjin turned to him. "What part?" "This." Felix gestured toward the apartment. No dramatic reunions, no grand speeches, just making breakfast together. Hyunjin felt warmth spread through his chest. "I'm sorry it took me so long to understand." Felix smiled gently. "We're here now." After breakfast, they decided to organize the apartment together. Boxes that had remained unopened since Hyunjin returned were finally carried into the living room. One by one, they sorted through old notebooks, photographs, concert tickets, and souvenirs collected over the years. At the bottom of the final box, Hyunjin found a small wooden music box. The varnish had faded and the tiny handle was scratched. Felix's eyes widened. "You still have it." "I couldn't throw it away." Hyunjin carefully turned the handle. A delicate melody filled the room. The tune was simple, almost childlike, yet it carried countless memories. Years ago, they had stumbled upon a tiny antique market while traveling together. Felix had fallen in love with the music box, but the shopkeeper refused to lower the price. Hyunjin secretly returned later that afternoon and bought it as a surprise. When Felix received it, he had smiled so brightly that Hyunjin thought no treasure in the world could compare. "I remember saying I'd keep it forever," Felix whispered. "You did." Felix looked at him. "So did you." Hyunjin nodded. "I just forgot that forever isn't something you protect by running away." Room fell quiet again. This silence was different from the ones they had shared before. There was no uncertainty hidden inside it, only understanding. Later that afternoon, they visited the small park where children flew colourful kites beneath a clear blue sky. Families laughed together, dogs chased balls across the grass. The world felt wonderfully ordinary. They found an empty bench beneath a large maple tree. Felix leaned back and closed his eyes. "I used to think happiness had to be extraordinary." Hyunjin smiled. "And now?" Felix opened his eyes and looked around. "I think happiness is being able to sit beside someone without worrying they'll disappear tomorrow." Hyunjin looked down at his hands. "I made you live with that fear." "You did." Felix reached over and gently intertwined their fingers. "But today you're here." Hyunjin squeezed his hand softly. "And tomorrow," Felix smiled, "and the day after that." The afternoon breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the park. Somewhere nearby, a street musician began playing an acoustic guitar. The melody drifted gently through the air, blending with the laughter of children and the rustling leaves. Hyunjin listened quietly before speaking. "Spent years asking myself whether I deserved another chance." Felix looked at him. "I don't think that's the right question anymore. Will you make this chance count?" Hyunjin didn't hesitate. "Every single day." Felix believed him, not because the words were perfect, because Hyunjin no longer sounded like someone making promises out of guilt. He sounded like someone who had finally learned the value of staying. As the sun slowly dipped toward the horizon, they walked home at an unhurried pace. Their shadows stretched long across the sidewalk, side by side. Neither of them knew exactly what the future would bring. There would still be difficult days. There would still be misunderstandings, worries, and moments of doubt. But those moments no longer felt frightening, because they had learned that love was not measured by how perfectly two people avoided pain. It was measured by whether they chose to face that pain together. When they reached the apartment building, Hyunjin paused before unlocking the door. He looked at Felix with a quiet smile. "Thank you for asking me that day." Felix tilted his head. "What day? May I still wait for you?" Felix smiled, his eyes warm with quiet certainty. "I'm glad I asked." Hyunjin took a slow breath. "And I'm glad I finally stayed." Outside, the evening sky deepened into shades of violet as the city lights flickered on one by one. Inside, laughter once again filled the apartment, not because life had become perfect, but because two hearts, once separated by fear and silence, had finally discovered that home was never a place. It had always been the person who was willing to stay beside you, no matter how long the journey back took. A gentle breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the open window as the apartment filled with the soft glow of another peaceful morning. Hyunjin was already awake. He stood on the balcony, watching the city slowly come to life. The streets below were beginning to fill with people hurrying toward work, cafes unlocking their doors and buses rolling through the quiet neighborhoods. A pair of footsteps approached from behind. Without saying anything, Felix draped a light blanket over Hyunjin's shoulders. Catch a cold. Hyunjin smiled. You still worry too much. I probably always will. Hyunjin turned to face him, and I don't mind anymore. Felix laughed quietly before leaning beside him against the railing. For several minutes they simply watched the sunrise together. The silence between them had become familiar once again, not the silence of distance but the silence of comfort. You know, Felix said softly, I used to think mornings were the hardest. Hyunjin looked at him. Because I always expected a message that never came. Hyunjin lowered his gaze. I checked my phone every day. Felix looked surprised. You did. I wrote hundreds of messages. Hyunjin smiled sadly. Never had the courage to send them. Felix shook his head with a gentle sigh. We wasted so much time being afraid. We're not afraid anymore. Hyunjin nodded. No. After breakfast, they decided to visit the seaside where they had once spent an entire summer watching the waves. The journey was longer than they remembered, but neither of them minded. When they finally reached the beach, the salty breeze greeted them immediately. The ocean stretched endlessly beneath a bright blue sky, its waves rolling gently onto the sand. Felix slipped off his shoes first. Missed this. Hyunjin followed him, letting the cool water wash over his feet. Missed seeing you smile like this. Felix looked toward the horizon. There were days I thought I'd forgotten how. Hyunjin quietly picked up a smooth white shell resting near the shoreline. I wanted to bring you back here years ago. What stopped you? Self. Felix understood without needing another explanation. Fear had always been Hyunjin's greatest enemy, not other people, not distance, himself. They walked along the shoreline until they reached the old wooden pier where they had once carved their initials into a weathered bench. The wood had aged, worn smooth by rain and sunlight, yet the carving remained. F and H small, crooked, almost hidden. Felix ran his fingers gently across the faded letters. I can't believe it's still here. Hyunjin smiled. Some things survive longer than we expect. Felix turned toward him. Us. Hyunjin met his eyes. I hope so. Felix didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and unfolded a tiny piece of paper. What is that? I found it while cleaning my room. Hyunjin accepted it carefully. It was an old receipt from a convenience store. On the back, written in Felix's familiar handwriting, were a few simple words. No matter where life takes us, I hope we'll always find our way back. Hyunjin stared at the sentence for a long time. You wrote this, the day we came here. You kept it all these years. Felix smiled. Guess I never stopped believing. Hyunjin folded the paper with extraordinary care before slipping it into his wallet. It belongs with me now. Their afternoon passed slowly. They bought ice cream from a small stand near the beach. They laughed when a strong gust of wind nearly blew Felix's napkin into the ocean. They argued playfully about who had walked farther. For the first time in years, neither of them measured time by what they had lost. They measured it by what they were creating together. As sunset painted the sky with shades of orange and rose, they sat at the end of the pier. The waves reflected the fading light like liquid gold. Felix rested his arms on the wooden railing. I used to think waiting meant standing still. Hyunjin listened quietly. But now I think waiting can also mean growing. He smiled softly. Even when someone isn't beside you. Hyunjin felt his throat tighten. You grew stronger. Felix shook his head. So did you. Hyunjin looked toward the endless sea. I don't want us to live in the shadow of those missing years anymore. Felix nodded. Neither do I. Let's make new memories. Felix smiled. Kind will never have to remember with regret. Sun slowly disappeared beyond the horizon. The first stars began to appear overhead. Hyunjin reached for Felix's hand, and this time there was no hesitation, no fear that tomorrow would take everything away again. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as if they had never been apart. The waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore, carrying away footprints from the sand but never erasing the journey that had brought them back to one another. And beneath the quiet evening sky, they understood that love was never about finding the perfect moment. It was about choosing the same person, again and again, until ordinary days became the most precious memories of all.